Hello everyone. I know you're here to use this video to help you sleep better, and I'm here to help you do just that. All you need to do is listen and relax. Before we begin, you can comment below and let me know where you're watching from. What time is it now? Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to hear the next episodes. Now just relax. This happened in middle school over the summer during a field trip organized by the school. It was just 2 days and 1 night, where my classmates and I visited a historical museum and other places in the capital. We were assigned 4 kids to a room with 2 queen-sized beds. We had 1 male and 2 female teachers as chaperones, but they got their own rooms on the same hotel floor. I have trouble sleeping in strange beds, and I woke up in the middle of the night and couldn't fall back asleep. My 3 roommates were soundly asleep, and I envied them. I grabbed my phone and started doom scrolling when I saw, or sensed, maybe that's a better word, something out of the corner of my eye. The wall in the far corner looked different. Have you ever heard the story, maybe a creepypasta or an internet legend, about that guy who lived an entire life after an accident, had a wife, kids, and a career, but then became obsessed with the perspective of a lamp, which is how he woke up and realized the whole thing had been a dream? That's what the walls felt like, off somehow. Now to clarify, I didn't see a shadow, face, or ghost. It was like the walls themselves were just off-kilter, as if drawn by a child who doesn't understand perspective yet. I wondered if I was still asleep or dreaming that I had woken up and was using my phone. I also thought maybe I was having eyesight issues and decided to tell my mom once I got home. I fell asleep with my phone on my chest. In the morning, as the others slowly woke up, I looked at those walls again, and everything seemed normal, so I knew I had been dreaming. But I noticed something else. The others were awake and starting to arrange their things, but none of them would look at each other. The vibe was just weird. I chalked it up to being tired and not looking forward to the long bus ride. As we were about to leave, one classmate named Sam asked out loud, "Did you guys see that thing last night?" I asked what he meant, just to be sure, and he said the walls were off. I started nodding aggressively in agreement. The others said the same thing. We realized we had all woken up, but they had been too scared to move. I was the only one who had grabbed my phone and acted like nothing was wrong. We speculated about what it could have been throughout the 2-day trip. On the bus ride home, we asked others if they had seen anything strange, but no one else had. Just us. We couldn't even describe what we saw or experienced. I started calling it a glitch in the Matrix, but the other guys hadn't seen the franchise, so they didn't get the reference. Feel old yet? Some kids don't even know what the Matrix is. When some girls showed interest, my classmates changed the story, saying we had seen the shadow of a man burned into the walls to make it more spooky for them. I didn't participate in that because what happened felt like something more than just paranormal or fake ghost stuff. All 4 of us had seen it, or we had all dreamed it at the same time. And I've never heard of people sharing dreams like that. But what could it have been? When Airbnb first became popular, I thought it was the greatest idea imaginable. I wanted to take a summer vacation somewhere without spending too much, because I live in the loudest, most child-populated residential building in the world. I swear, some mornings, especially in the summer, kids were running around with water guns. Going somewhere to relax on my own, without having to deal with other families and their unruly kids, sounded fantastic. I found this great spot. It was a little beach house. The app said it wasn't in a tourist town, so it was never the high season, which was perfect. I booked it at a great price, asked for my PTO, and went on my way. It was somewhat far off, but I realized that getting out of the city was my only option for some peace and quiet. I passed some beaches and cringed at the number of cars in the parking lots, just not my scene. So I kept going. As I drove further, I started to worry. My GPS said I was going in the right direction, but I was leaving civilization behind. I stopped to stretch my legs and felt like I had stumbled into some cowboy movie, except grayer. I tried calling the Airbnb host, but they didn't answer, so I got back in the car and kept driving. Finally, I saw that the destination was close on my GPS, and when I arrived, I gasped. It was the same little house I had seen in the photos, but it looked much tinier and lonelier than the app showed. I parked in front and looked around. Ah, yes, technically it could be called a beach house, but not the kind of beach anyone could actually use. There was no access to it. It sat on an odd low cliff, with big moldy rocks and a stretch of stone and sand before the water. So the tiny beach house I rented in this never high season town was basically in the middle of nowhere, next to a sea I couldn't even swim in. Did they lie about it on the app? Not exactly, but it was definitely misleading. I grabbed my phone to complain, but my mobile data wasn't working. Inside, I couldn't find any Wi-Fi either. I tried calling again, but no one answered. The interior was the only thing the app didn't lie about. It was comfortable and had air conditioning, which I turned on and enjoyed. I thought maybe this was what I needed after all. I loved the beach, but swimming here was impossible and dangerous. A little peace and quiet to reflect didn't sound so bad. I grabbed my things from the car and settled in. The kitchen worked, the bathroom had excellent water flow, and there was some kind of cable TV, though the image wasn't great. The first thing I did was make something to eat with the groceries I brought. I took a chair outside, sat by the window, and enjoyed the sound of the waves. It was excellent, until it wasn't. Night fell quicker than I expected, and it got eerily quiet. But I reminded myself this was exactly what I wanted. I went inside, took a long shower, and settled down to enjoy the air conditioning and just think about life. Then the power went out. I thought it would come back soon, but it didn't. 2 hours passed, and the tiny house became unbearably hot, despite the location. I looked for candles or anything, but found nothing. I used my phone light, opened the windows and the door to let the breeze in, which helped a little. But it was way too dark to feel safe. I tried calling my hosts again, but they still didn't answer. In my head, I was already planning my serious complaint to Airbnb to get this listing taken down. As the night went on, every little sound from the breeze made me more anxious. I was only glad the moon was shining so brightly. I made a cold sandwich to pass the time, and at one point, something, maybe a bird, flew close by and squeaked. Though I've been told most birds are asleep at night, it could have been an owl. I refused to think about what else it could be. I finally decided to go to bed and try to sleep. I had to close the door, but left the window next to the bed open for the breeze. I lay on the stiff mattress longer than I wanted, watching strange shadows move outside and listening to the quiet, which wasn't really quiet at all. I hadn't realized how many things you can hear when there are no electronics on. The mosquitoes buzzed in my ear, the furniture creaked, and even my own breathing became distracting. I closed my eyes, trying to sleep, when I felt the moonlight disappear suddenly behind my lids, like something was blocking the window. I didn't want to open my eyes, partly because I was tired, and partly because, well, I'm not sure why, but I kept them shut. Eventually, the moonlight returned, and I drifted off. In the morning, the power was still out, and the hosts still weren't answering. I couldn't take it anymore. I had booked the place for a week, but I packed up and left. I stopped at one of the beaches on the way back, had the best fried fish of my life, drank an awesome margarita, and listened to the people around me. A kid started crying next to me, and while I can't say I was grateful for it, I had to admit that loner, hermit life wasn't for me. Oh, and I did complain about that tiny house, and the listing was taken down. The account was thankfully removed from Airbnb too. I checked for months, just in case. I must have been around 7 or 8 years old when my mother enrolled me in Girl Scouts, and we went on an outdoor mission the first week after school ended. I know there were real Girl Scout camps, but there weren't any in my area. Some older members were exploring the idea of starting one, but for this trip, they rented a spot in a regular campground and sent us off. My mother had been a Girl Scout since she was a little girl and became a counselor during her college years. She wanted me to join too, because she still had friends from those times and said that I could use the social skills. I wasn't a huge introvert, but I wasn't the life of the party either. Our counselors must have been in their mid-20s, or at least over 18. They were all girls. I quickly noticed that some of us weren't especially suited for the wilderness, despite what the scouts were supposed to represent. It was one thing to catalog flowers in your friend's mom's big garden, and a whole other to truly try to survive in the woods. We were around 30 little girls being managed by 3 18 to 20-year-olds. I understood faster than others that our counselors weren't as dedicated to the task as the people who were normally in charge during the school year. My first year as a scout, we had an older woman as a troop leader. I'll call her Mrs. Evans. She was essentially training the younger ones who became our counselors, but didn't come with us on that excursion. My peers started to notice the indifference of our counselors soon enough, and one of those girls was Tana. She was a natural leader, even at 8 years old. Some people just have it, and it wasn't because she was popular. She was organized and could take charge. I'm sure that attitude served her well wherever she is. But that summer trip could have messed us all up. It was day 3, and Tana had managed to get on the radar of one of those counselors. I'll call her Paula. As luck would have it, Paula was Mrs. Evans's granddaughter. Big cliché, the Nepo baby who doesn't care. Anyway, another thing that made us all admire Tana was that she knew how to talk back. I don't know if she did it at home, but she stood up for herself, even when it would have been more convenient to just shut up and take it. Paula hated that Tana corrected her and did it often, even when Paula grimaced and spoke through her teeth. Tana didn't care, and soon enough, we were all snickering at how angry Paula got every time she was wrong. It was small, inconsequential things, like not knowing the real name of a plant and how a compass works in real life. The worst happened during a longer hike. Paula was leading the entire group of 30 girls on her own. The other counselors stayed back to prepare for another activity they had planned, otherwise known as doing nothing and smoking weed. But I didn't understand any of that until Tana told us later. She was also more knowledgeable and street smart than the rest of us. Anyway, about an hour into the hike, we were completely lost. Paula had a map in her hands, but she turned it over many times and got her phone out, but there wasn't enough data to get Google Maps working. Some of the girls raised their hands with suggestions like, "Miss Paula, let's look for moss on the side of trees. Let's follow the tracks back. Let's do this," etc. Paula lost her last nerve, screaming, "Shut up! I know what I'm doing and you don't." You may ask who else lost her marbles. Well, Tana did. She laughed loud, echoing through the trees, and said things like, "You have no idea what you're doing. I can't believe you're even related to Mrs. Evans." I think Paula was 2 seconds away from slapping Tana, but that little 8-year-old took the map out of her hands, told us to follow her, and started walking. We followed. As we walked, Tana explained how to find clues in the forest. Actual, very important things that we should know to try and survive in the wilderness, and we were back at camp in no time. We all cheered, clapped, and hugged Tana, saying that she was the best and that she should be a counselor. Paula heard it all as she stomped past us and beyond to the other counselors. One of them told us to rest and get ready because we had other stuff to do that day. But we had barely changed and chatted a little before Paula called Tana out. I knew that what was coming wouldn't be good, but they made the other girls stay near the campsite. I didn't see it, but here's what happened. Paula and another counselor took Tana to the small meadow, tied her to a beach chair one of them had brought, and impaled it into the ground. They proceeded to slap Tana's face until their hands hurt and left her there for hours. They returned, telling us that Tana had a special task for the group and wouldn't be joining us for some time. At night, we grew concerned, and I wasn't brave or really a leader. But when the other girls said that they would sneak past the counselors to see if they could find Tana, I went along. We found her quickly. That day had been scorching. Tana's face wasn't only red from the slaps, she was sunburned to a crisp and thirsty like nothing else. One of us had thought about bringing water, and she gulped it down pretty fast. I had never imagined any adult would be capable of such a horrible act. We untied Tana, took her to the tent, and one of us had a phone, Christy, because her mom was very paranoid about things, and we called her. Soon, all the parents were informed. Mrs. Evans arrived at the campsite a few hours later. She guided us to the parking lot, where several parents had volunteered to come get us and carpool around until we all got home. Tana's parents wanted to press charges on Paula and her friend, but I'm not sure what happened with that. They must have reached a settlement because I never heard of any escalation, court hearing, or even an arrest. Mrs. Evans had to quit Girl Scouts. Sadly, I felt bad for her because she was an awesome woman, but her granddaughter had been involved, and there was no coming back from that. Meanwhile, I also begged my mother to quit. She allowed it because what happened was just too horrible for words. And after that, she let me develop my social skills however I wanted. Rest assured that group activities were never my thing again. Do you know why Stranger Things Season 1 was so popular? Because it used to be our lives, obviously without the upside down and paranormal stuff. But once upon a time, all we did was ride bikes and spend time with our friends, looking for adventures or pretending we were on one. This was particularly true for me during the summer. I'm sorry for sounding like a complete boomer, but I don't see kids these days doing that. I know that's in part because of technology, the internet, PlayStation, streaming, blah blah blah. I also suppose parents are a lot more careful than they used to be. My parents didn't care where I was, as long as I wasn't bothering them at home. I've talked to some neighbors lately, and they seem worse than helicopter parents. It's like someone is going to snatch their babies away at any minute, like a hawk with a tiny dog. My wife and I are child-free, so we'll never have that problem. And I like it because I couldn't stomach the idea that I'd have to restrict so much of my kids' freedom. My best memories came from those times when my friends and I got away and did secret stuff behind our parents' backs. Some things were not something any adult would approve of. We stole adult magazines. But there's even more access to that today, I guess. Yeah, the world is scary, but most of the time, we were just being kids and expanding our imaginations. I remember one particular summer was the most fun, and the one that reminded me so much of Stranger Things later on. Now, let me start by painting a picture of where we lived. It looked like the town from Edward Scissorhands, but not so colorful. There was also an abandoned house at the far end, but it wasn't on a hill, so that one looked more like the one in the new It. Yes, there was a story to that house, and everyone knew it. A couple of years before my time, an old woman died in there, and her body decomposed for some time before the smell reached the neighbors. They got the house cleaned up, and it was put up for sale, but no one bought it. It randomly burned down one day, which left it with black, dark gray outside walls, and they gave up trying to sell it. My family moved to that neighborhood years later, and by the time I had any kind of consciousness, I knew everyone avoided that place. That summer, I won't tell you the exact date, my buddies and I, 11 to 13 years old, were somehow obsessed with Monopoly. I know I said before that my friends and I looked for adventures, so we should have been playing Dungeons and Dragons like that show. But no, we liked Monopoly because it was also a pretty long game. One of my friends, Jonas, had made us start playing because his dad told his mom that it was a smart game and would help him in life. His mom was very strict, unlike the rest of our folks. But with that game, he got to have us all in his room for hours, playing almost every day without an issue. Anyway, one night we finally got bored because most of us went bankrupt, and only 2 were left in this weird stalemate. We packed up the game and talked about owning houses in real life. Jonah said that he would be happy with his parents' place. I wanted something bigger because my house with my 4 siblings was way too small. Another friend, Gary, said that he wanted something close to the city, like a penthouse or condo because they looked so fancy to him, but he wanted a beach house too for vacation. So his plan was to make a lot of money, and we all agreed that we would all have a ton of money and do whatever we wanted. Suddenly, one buddy, Patrick, asked if any of us would buy the abandoned house. We laughed, obviously not, but he said, "Think about it, it's the cheapest house in the neighborhood." It was also the biggest plot. He would tear it down and do whatever he wanted with the land. I said that I would never, because the house was obviously cursed. Anyone else could have bought it all these years, but they didn't for a reason. Saying things like that at our age gets you teased or mocked in any group of friends, and I was embarrassed, but I said something like, "If you guys are so brave, let's go there right now and check it out." That got them quiet real quick, and I laughed. "See? You guys are too scared because I'm telling the truth." Patrick started shaking his finger, saying that he wasn't scared at all. He added that we should all go right then and there to explore, and Jonas said that there was no way his mother would let him go out with us so late. It wasn't late, it was just nighttime already. The other two friends I haven't mentioned were Charlie and Christian. They were twins and agreed with Patrick. I couldn't back down, so I said, "Screw it, let's go." We planned to sneak out of Jonas's window so his mom would think that we were still in there playing. Jonas felt a little rebellious, so he joined, and we climbed out, making a ton of noise. I don't know how Mrs. Jonas's mom didn't hear us. We got our bikes and walked them further away until we could ride. I remember that moment felt so exhilarating, even though I had believed the stories about that house. The idea of going with my friends on an adventure on a hot summer night was like nothing in the world. It was very freeing. We pedaled, but as we got closer to the house, we saw a small light flickering in one of the windows. I almost fell forward on my bike because I hit the brakes way too hard. The rest followed my lead, their bikes echoing that metallic screeching that's so recognizable. I told them, "Wait a minute, someone's in there." Jonas's rebellion suddenly wore off pretty quickly, and he said that he wanted to go back. Patrick responded, "Let's see who it is," and Charlie and Christian agreed. Now Gary said, "Let's go back and tell Jonas's mom," and they all looked at me. I wanted to leave, but also didn't. I was morbidly curious, so I said, "Let's just take a peek inside." The others asked how we were going to do that, so I told them that we would leave our bikes, crawl into the garden just like we did to get out of Jonas's house, and take a look through the window. Jonas didn't want to do that. Patrick asked him what the worst that could happen was, and Jonas said the ghost of the old lady could be there. Patrick rolled his eyes, saying, "Ghosts don't turn on lights." They went back and forth for a while, so I told Jonas, "Hey, you and Gary can go back and act like we're still around, and the rest of us will do this quickly, and we'll be back soon." Jonas and Gary nodded, and they left. So the remaining four of us left our bikes on the sidewalk and jogged silently to the abandoned house. The smell hit me hard because I had pressed my body too close to the walls. Years had passed, but I could smell the smoke. I started coughing, and Patrick covered my mouth, giving me this look. I managed to remain quiet, but everyone smelled that smoke too. It was such a weird odor, but we kept going. We reached a window that was reflecting a bit of light and stayed down beneath the windowsill. Now that we were closer, it was clear that the light came from a candle. I whispered, asking who would peek first, and the twins shook their heads, so this was between me and Patrick. He said that he would do it. After hesitating for a second, he started lifting his head and came down quickly, saying someone was definitely there. "Who?" I asked. "A man, I think," Patrick said. "Okay, I'll look," I said. It was like a dark shape covered in clothes, and I think a blanket. He was sitting on the floor with his body hunched almost over the candle, and something was in his hands. I didn't understand what he was doing. I got down and told the guys what I had seen and described the item in the man's hands. Patrick peeked again and stayed there a while. He knelt after and said, "I think it's something to inhale. I think he's smoking." I was confused, so I went up again, but when I did, I only saw the figure for 1 second before he turned his entire body toward me. I got spooked a bit until another larger figure came right to the window, and at that point, all hell broke loose. I screamed, Patrick screamed, the twins screamed, and we all ran off to our bikes. We didn't stop screaming until we got close to Jonas's house, and we lost all sense of pretense. We knocked on the door and told Mrs. Jonas everything about that house. Gary and Jonas came out of his room and were all scared, but Jonas's mom called the other parents, and someone called the cops. The long and short of it is, those two guys were a pair of junkies who had been squatting in the abandoned house for a few days before we discovered them. We got in trouble, naturally, and we tried to say that Gary and Jonas didn't come with us, but Jonas's mom wasn't an idiot. She said she would be letting the parents know, and we all got grounded for at least 2 months. But the rest of the neighborhood was relieved that we had brought it to their attention, and no one else ever came into that house again after that. So yeah, Stranger Things is a perfect reminder of our childhood and what it was like, at least for me. There's something hauntingly nostalgic about it, and I can't stop thinking about those childhood summers. Sometimes I heard whispers when I was alone. I thought it was my imagination. My parents seemed happy at first. They worked hard to make the house a home. Dad, and then she turned and walked back to her room. The next morning, she didn't remember a thing. Things got worse. Dad became more and more ill. He was in pain all the time and couldn't work. Mom looked tired and sad. She started having strange dreams and couldn't sleep. I tried to help, but I was just a kid. I didn't understand what was happening. One evening, I found an old book in the attic. It was covered in dust, its pages yellowed with age. The book told the story of the house. It had been built, and once alive, doors slammed shut, windows shattered, and the walls shook. It was like the house was angry. Dad died shortly after that night. His death was sudden and unexplained. The doctors were baffled. Mom was devastated. She couldn't cope and soon fell into a deep depression. She stopped eating, stopped talking, and finally, she too passed away. I was left alone in the house, feeling its cold grip around me. I moved away as soon as I could, but the house stayed with me, haunting my dreams. I kept thinking about the house. The cycle of misfortune continued. Priests, shamans, and even modern paranormal investigators tried to break the curse, but nothing worked. The house remained a place of sorrow. Now, as an adult, I often drive by the old house. It still stands tall and proud, but I can see the sadness on its walls. I think about the families that have suffered there, including my own. I think about the lives lost, the dreams shattered, and I feel a burning desire to end it. I want to destroy the house, burn it to the ground. I can't let the house continue to destroy lives. I owe it to my parents and to all the families who have suffered to find a way to break the curse. One day, I gathered my courage and drove to the house. I stood in front of it, feeling its cold, dark presence. I took a deep breath and walked up the steps. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The air was heavy, filled with sadness and anger. I could hear the whispers and feel the house watching me. I didn't know what I would do, but I had to try. I had to end it now. It was empty. My job was to walk around and make sure everything was okay. Every hour, I had to check all the rooms and write down that nothing was wrong. I started my shift at 10 p.m. and finished at 6 a.m. The first few nights were quiet. I brought a book to read and drank coffee to stay awake. I liked the silence. It gave me time to think. But on the fourth night, things changed. It started like any other night. I arrived at 9:45 p.m. and took over from the day guard. I stopped and listened. The whispering stopped too. I shook my head and told myself it was just the wind. At midnight, I was in the basement. The basement was the creepiest part of the building. It was cold and damp, and it smelled like mold. I was about to leave when I heard the whispering again. This time, it was louder. It sounded like it was coming from the dark corner of the room. "Who's there?" I called out. My voice echoed in the empty room. There was no answer. I shone my flashlight into the corner but saw nothing. At 3 a.m., I had to do my next round. I was nervous, but I forced myself to go. As I walked through the empty rooms, I felt like the shadows were closing in on me. The whispering started again, louder and clearer. It sounded like a voice, but I couldn't understand the words. I felt a cold breath on my neck and turned around quickly. The room was empty. I searched, but there was no sign of anyone. I went back to the office, my hands shaking. I couldn't explain what I had seen. I felt like I was losing my mind. I checked the monitors again, but the figure was gone. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, but I knew it wasn't. At 5 a.m., I was exhausted. I just wanted the night to end. I decided to do one last round. As I walked through the building, I felt like I was being followed. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I saw nothing. I couldn't handle another night in that building. The memory of that night still haunts me. Sometimes, I hear the whispering in my dreams and wake up in a cold sweat. I'll never forget my time as a night shift security guard. Back in the late summer of 2010, I was just about to start graduate school, and I had to find myself a new flat for the coming year. I was new to the area, so I didn't know the neighborhoods at all, and since I needed something cheap and cheerful, I ended up browsing vacancies in some of the city's less affluent areas. Some of the listings were frankly terrifying, and I'm surprised the landlords had the audacity to even advertise them. Others, however, were considerably more livable, or at least they appeared that way thanks to some carefully chosen angles and a lot of window shots. Over the course of a week, I'd booked 10 different viewings, and by the end of the third day, I was on the verge of an emotional breakdown. A playful exaggeration on my part, of course, but honestly, it was just so draining. I'd been to 6 of the 10 viewings that I had lined up, and each and every one had been a complete letdown. The places were either riddled with mold, obnoxiously close to a restaurant or bar so that they stank of old chip oil and cigarette smoke, or they were the size of a shoebox. Luckily, my next viewing, which was late in the afternoon the following day, was with a landlady that had advertised a females-only listing. The pictures of the place made it seem quite nice, and I was very attracted to the idea of living in a SE, secure environment. Space because of the added security it would bring. I know, maybe to some of you that might sound a little cynical, and I'm well aware it's not all men who pose a problem, but in the context of what I'm about to tell you, I refuse to apologize for my cynicism, or as other girls might phrase it, realism. Some guys are just creeps. It's a fact of life. So the idea of living with just girls in a shared house was massively appealing. But then, that would be massively appealing to just about any girl moving to or living in London, surely. Getting a viewing appointment would be impossible, or so I thought, but it wasn't. I got one within a few days, which I thought was me getting lucky, but really, that should have been my first red flag. I was just way too optimistic to see it. The next day, as I got the bus over towards Camden, I remember being a mix of excited and nervous. I had so much faith in the place and had texted with the landlady, a woman named Jan, so I was confident that it was going to be a decent place. But at the same time, I'd been let down so relentlessly over the past few days that I had this looming sense of dread as I got closer and closer to my stop. At the time, I thought it was just residual trauma from being continually disappointed, but now I'm starting to think it was more like a kind of spidey sense. And so I got off the bus and I immediately texted Jan to let her know that I was nearby, as she'd asked me to do because she said she was really busy and might need a reminder. She texted me back almost right away, but when I expanded the message notification, I saw it was a lot more than just a simple okay or thanks, see you soon. It said something like, "Hi, I've been terribly busy, so my brother-in-law will be there to let you in and show you around." So much for female only, right? I thought that was the whole selling point. But then I understood that Jan was probably a very busy lady if she owned several properties all over London, so I wasn't about to throw a fit over one little thing like that. And so, off, I went to meet up with Jan's brother-in-law and to view what could potentially be my brand new home. When I arrived, I saw that the flats were in a unit above a line of shops. I'd been instructed to knock on the door, so I did. And when the door opened, Jan's brother-in-law was standing in the threshold. He looked strange, and that's putting it nicely. The way he looked at me in those first moments of eye contact made me feel a lot less comfortable than I did before. I mean it when I say that I'm not some man-hater, but I wasn't at all pleased about having to deal with a man in what was supposed to be a female-only flat complex, especially not since he was giving off these creepy vibes. If it had been any other circumstance, there's no way I'd have stepped into an empty room with that guy, but I'd pinned almost all my flat-finding hopes on this place. So I put on a brave face and a polite voice, then stepped inside and followed him to the flat. As soon as we stepped inside, my heart sank. It wasn't remotely like it had been advertised, not just because it looked like someone was already living there, but because I was pretty sure the pictures weren't even of the same place. I asked Jan's brother-in-law when the current tenant was due to vacate, and my heart sank even further when he said something like, "Well, yeah, that's the thing. The property we were going to show you has been taken off the market, and this is the only one we've got available for you in this area, and it's a shared unit." That was all very disappointing to hear. Devastating, even. But the thing that mattered most was securing somewhere to live and ensuring it was female only. Potentially, I could cope with a new flatmate as long as she was a girl. But when I asked the guy if the current tenant was female, he literally dodged the question. I asked him, plain as day, is it still an all-female occupancy? And he responded with, if you'd follow me this way, I can show you the vacant bedroom and attached bathroom. Then he just trotted off like I hadn't asked him anything and opened up the... I followed him into the bedroom, thinking I might as well have a look. While it wasn't actually all that bad compared to some of the others I'd seen, he still hadn't answered my question about the unit being female only. I looked around the bedroom and, remaining polite, asked him once again if the unit was female only or not. The man sort of wiggled his head and made a face that suggested he wasn't sure. He then said he'd have to contact Jan to make sure because he didn't know off the top of his head. I was starting to get really annoyed, but I kept my cool as he asked if I wanted to see the attached bathroom. I was literally on the verge of just saying no when he stepped forward and opened the door. As he did, I was hit with this truly revolting smell. It was so bad that I winced. I know the guy saw me wince from how rank the smell was. So when I said, no thanks, I think I'd like to have another look at the kitchen, I'm pretty sure he knew I was lying, unless he really was as stupid as he looked. Honestly, I just wanted to get away from the smell, and I didn't care at all what the kitchen looked like when the bathroom bloody stank. I was actually just going to walk towards the front door and see myself out after a brief and very passive-aggressive word of thanks. But then as I walked, something clicked about all the stuff that was left around the flat. By that point in my life, I had lived with girls and only girls. Even from when I was a kid, my dad wasn't around, and it was just me, my sister, and my mom. Then when I left for uni, I only lived with girls there too. Not to be too crass, but I knew what boys' bedrooms looked like. And that's what clicked in my head as I walked through the flat. It looked like a man lived there. And of course, I knew that it was a man living there, because the guy wouldn't answer my bloody question. But it seemed like a certain type of man lived there. This is where I made a huge error in judgment. I put it down to the continual disappointment and the stress of thinking that I was going to be forced to pick some absolute crap house to be miserable in for the next year plus. But when I realized that it wasn't just any old man living there, but the one currently showing me around, everything started to fall into place. I got out my phone and called Jan's number. As the guy followed me out of the bedroom, his phone started to ring in his pocket. I wasn't supposed to have his number, was I? He was just supposed to be meeting me there. So hearing the phone that Jan had been texting from start ringing in his pocket confirmed all my worst suspicions about this man. And he knew it too. He knew I'd figured it out, and I wish I'd been wearing a bloody GoPro. Because the look on his face was one I wish I had framed as a picture hanging in my bathroom. I think that's what did it, how I sort of, sensed his weakness. I had caught some absolute waste of a man trying to trick desperate girls into living in a spare room he looked like he built himself, with some really dodgy plumbing too, by the smell of things. Red-handed. That was the phrase that came to my mind in the moment. Red bloody-handed. And I'd be damned if I was about to let him live it down. I remember trying to think of something witty to say, but all I could think of was to ask him the exact question on my mind, I suppose as a way to humiliate him. So I started asking, were you trying to trick young girls into living with you? His face turned as red as a tomato, but he still tried denying it. The indignation I felt from his denial only spurred me on. I started telling him how pathetic he was, what a pervert he was, and how he was probably on the sex offenders registry. I gave him both barrels, as they say, didn't hold back in the slightest. But I forgot the golden rule when dealing with men. They're bigger, they're stronger, and the mental midgets among them are only one piece of wounded pride away from using that to their advantage. I saw the moment I pushed him over the edge. It really was like that meme, and it was in that moment she knew she effed up. He stopped talking, gave up on denying everything, and then started marching towards me with this wild look in his eyes. I knew he was going to go for me. I got a head start running down the corridor toward the block's entrance, but he was just too fast. I almost made it to the door and had my hand on the latch when I felt something tugging on my hair. I felt the pressure on my scalp, and then the next thing I knew, my neck jerked back as the guy grabbed a handful of my hair and started dragging me backward. I tried to stay on my feet, but the force of him pulling my head back knocked me off balance. As I fell backward, I realized he was actually trying to drag me back toward the flat, using nothing but my hair. I remember screaming for help, hoping someone from the other flats, there were maybe 3 or 4 on that floor, would hear me. But if they were occupied, whoever lived there must have been at work or dead, because I screamed so hard that my nose started to bleed, and no one emerged from any of the doors. Once I realized I was on my own, and we were just feet away from him, dragging me back into his flat, I tried to flip myself over so I could at least stand up, but right when I found a bit of purchase on the carpet underneath, I felt something slam into my face so hard it made the vision in my left eye go all white. I brought a hand up to my face, covering that eye, and with my free hand, I made a desperately futile attempt to get his hand off my hair. The second my hand touched his, and I tried digging my nails into the skin of his hand, he violently tugged on my hair again and sent me crashing down onto my knees. I remember how, as I reached the doorway, he tried to drag me through it, but I made it very hard for him by blindly kicking and throwing punches, anything to try and hit him in the groin or scratch his eyes out. After making contact with at least one of my swings, I have a gap in my memory, presumably from where the guy hit me so hard that I fell unconscious for a minute or two. My last memory of trying to fight him off was as we reached the door, but the next thing I remember is being on the bedroom floor, with him dragging me towards the bathroom that stank of mold and rotten God knows what. There was this pain in my neck when I woke up, and I had a deep fear that if I tried to twist my way up to bite him, he might tug on my hair hard enough to break my neck. I was more terrified than I had ever been in my entire life. I had no idea what was happening, but the one thing I knew was that if he managed to get me into that bathroom, it would be all over for me. I remember rolling over, and it made my scalp burn with pain from all the hair that had been ripped out, but it allowed me to wheel around and grab the guy's wrists. He obviously thought I was still unconscious, so when I suddenly started moving, it took him completely by surprise. I was able to sink my teeth into the skin of his wrist until I saw his fingers open and felt my hair come loose from his grip. I tried to run, but he grabbed me again. This time, I remember launching myself at his face. He was trying to pin my arms by my sides by wrapping his arms around me, but I raised them too early for him to get a hold of them and started digging my fingernails into his eyes. It was so horrible because I could feel the bare flesh of his eyeballs giving way under my nails. It really makes me shudder to think about it now, but at the time, all I could think about was doing as much damage as possible, and it worked. He screamed so loud that it hurt my ears. Then he suddenly shoved me off him so hard that I went tumbling to the floor. I felt so dizzy that I struggled to find my feet, but it didn't matter, because the man intent on ending my life, and God knows what else before that, was in so much pain from scratching his eye that he couldn't see. He was covering them with both of his hands, screaming terrible, terrible things at me. But I listened to all of that as I was running towards the front door, knowing that there was no chance of him catching up to me. I remember coming out into the street outside and walking down the metal stairs that led up to the unit really fast. Then some woman saw me as she was walking past and exclaimed, "Oh my God, are you okay?" I had a cut on my face from where he hit me. I'm guessing that was the blow that knocked me out too, and it had been pouring blood down me without me realizing. When I saw just how much blood there was, I was terrified that he might have stabbed me or something. So I unzipped my jacket and started looking for stab wounds while saying to the woman to call the police. More and more people came over because the way I looked and the way I was shouting obviously attracted a lot of attention. I kept pointing to the door I had come through, saying, he's in there," because I felt my legs getting weak, and I honestly thought that I was about to pass out from the bleeding. If I passed out, I didn't know if I'd wake up again. Obviously, that was all just the terror talking, and despite all the blood, I didn't even need stitches after being taken to the hospital. But in that moment, I was the most scared I had ever been in my life, and convinced the guy had done way more damage to me. The police managed to track down the man who had attacked me, and he ended up getting a prison sentence of 6 years. I think if the jury were able to see into his head and got a glimpse of what he had in store for me, he'd have gotten much, much longer. Sadly, that's not how the law works here. And as much as I have my own trauma as a result of what happened, my worst fear is that he'll get his chance to do it again sooner rather than later. We didn't talk much about what had happened that night, but the memory lingered. It was a sobering reminder to always be cautious, to always be aware of our surroundings, and to always lock our doors. It was a lesson that had been learned the hard way, but one that stayed with me. Late at night, I heard sounds, like footsteps, light and hesitant, moving across the attic floor. My heart pounded as I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling or a raccoon. But the next morning, I found more signs. An empty can of beans on the kitchen counter that I hadn't opened, crumbs on the floor, and the attic door slightly ajar. Gathering my courage, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly climbed the attic stairs. The air was musty, and dust particles danced in the beam of light. "I won't call the police," he said softly, his voice shaking. "I have nowhere else to go." I could see the fear and desperation in his eyes. Something inside me softened. Instead of feeling scared, I felt a strange sense of empathy. "I'm not going to call the police," I replied, "but you need to tell me why you're here." His name was Jack. He had lost his job and home a few months ago and had been wandering the streets ever since. He found my attic one cold night and had been sneaking in for food and shelter. I thought about reaching out to some friends who might have job leads. Jack was grateful, and I could see him starting to hope again. Days turned into weeks, and Jack and I developed a routine. He would come by for meals, and we would work on job applications and practice interview skills. Slowly but surely, he started to regain his confidence. One evening, after he had left for the shelter, I realized how much my life had changed since he came into it. I no longer felt lonely. Jack had become a friend, someone I cared about deeply. Months passed, and Jack's life continued to improve. He got promoted at work, made new friends, and even started volunteering at the shelter where he once stayed. Seeing him grow and succeed filled my heart with joy. One evening, Jack invited me to his new apartment for dinner. As I walked in, I saw a framed photo on his wall of the two of us from one of our dinners. He smiled and said, "You changed my life, Sarah. I don't know where I'd be without you." Tears filled my eyes as I hugged him. Our friendship, which had grown from the unlikeliest of circumstances, had truly changed both of our lives. It was a dark and stormy night, the kind of night where the wind howled. He was drenched from the rain, and his clothes were tattered and dirty. His face was hidden in the shadows, but I could see his eyes. They were wild and frantic, like a cornered animal. My mom gasped and quickly locked the doors. She kept her foot on the brake, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. We both stared at the man, unsure of what to do. He looked desperate, but something about him felt wrong. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the fear creeping up my spine. One of the men had a crowbar, and he started hitting the driver's side window with it. The glass held firm, but I could see small cracks forming. My mom's eyes were wide with fear, and I knew we didn't have much time. "Hold on tight," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm going to get us out of here." She slammed her foot on the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward. The man with the crowbar jumped back just in time, avoiding the car by inches. My mom squeezed my hand, her grip reassuring but still trembling. "We're safe now," she said. "It's okay, we're safe." We drove in silence for a while, the only sound being the rain beating against the car and the hum of the engine. My mind was racing with thoughts and questions. Who were those men? What did they want? Why were they trying to get into our car? As we neared our neighborhood, the rain began to let up, and the storm started to pass. The sky was still dark, but I could see the faint glow of the streetlights. As we walked into the house, my mom wrapped her arm around my shoulders, pulling me close. The warmth and safety of home felt like a comforting blanket wrapping us in its embrace. We were safe, and that was all that mattered. I was 12 years old the first time I stayed home alone at night. My parents were going to a dinner party and promised to be back by 10. I was excited. At 9, I heard it for the first time, a soft, almost imperceptible noise coming from upstairs. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I heard it again. It sounded like someone was walking around up there. I paused the movie and listened intently. The house was silent. Maybe it was just the old house settling, I told myself. I had heard my parents say that 100 times before. Trying to shake off the unease, I resumed my movie, but I couldn't focus. Every little sound made me jump, and the wind outside howled. Grabbing a flashlight for protection, I crept toward the stairs. The wooden steps creaked under my feet, and I winced at every sound. I reached the top of the stairs and listened. Silence. I took a deep breath and started checking each room. The first room I checked was my parents' bedroom. I pushed the door open slowly and peeked inside. It was dark, but everything looked normal. Next, I checked my room. Again, nothing unusual. I started to feel a bit silly. Maybe it was just the house settling. I was about to go back downstairs when I remembered the attic. The stairs leading up to the attic were steep and narrow. I hesitated for a moment, but then I heard the noise again. Clear and unmistakable. It was a faint shuffling sound, like someone or something moving up there. I took a deep breath and started climbing the stairs. They creaked loudly with each step, and it felt like I was walking into a nightmare. When I reached the top, the attic was even darker than I remembered. I fumbled for the light switch and finally found it. The light flickered on, casting long shadows across the room. I was about to convince myself I was just being paranoid, but then I heard it again. This time, it was right behind me. I spun around, and my heart almost stopped. Standing in the shadows was a figure. It was tall and cloaked in darkness. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. What was this thing? How did it get into my house? I took another step back, and the figure moved closer. My heartbeat was loud and frantic. The police arrived after my frantic call. They searched the entire house, including the attic, but found nothing. No sign of the figure I had seen. They told my parents it was probably just my imagination, that maybe I had watched one too many scary movies. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew I would never forget that night. I never felt safe in that house again, especially when I was alone, because I knew somewhere in the shadows, that figure was still there, watching, waiting. That night, I finished my project from home, and no deadline was worth the terror I had experienced. To this day, I still can't fully understand what I went through. Anxiety began to creep in as the house became eerily quiet, and every creak of the old wooden floor seemed louder than usual. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. I settled down on the couch with a bowl of popcorn and turned on the TV. The flickering light from the screen cast eerie shadows across the walls. After a while, I heard a noise coming from the kitchen, a soft tapping sound. I paused the TV and listened, but the noise stopped. I shrugged it off, thinking I must have imagined it. But when I glanced back at the window, a face appeared in the dim light of the screen. It was a man with a pale face, wide, wild eyes, and a scruffy beard. His clothes were dirty and torn. My blood froze. I stood there, paralyzed, unable to move or speak. He raised his hand and tapped on the window again, harder this time. Snapping out of my daze, I backed away, my mind racing. I had to do something. I quickly grabbed my phone and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. "What's your emergency?" the calm voice of the operator asked. "There's a man outside my window," I whispered, afraid he might hear me. I tried not to make a sound, but I could hear his footsteps on the stairs getting closer. "He's inside the house," I whispered to the operator, my voice shaking. "Stay quiet, and stay where you are." "The police are almost there," she replied. I heard him trying each door, one by one. When he reached my bedroom door, he started pounding on it, trying to break it down. I pressed harder against the door, praying it would hold. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. The banging grew louder and more desperate. Just when I thought it was all over, I heard police sirens outside. I listened as they arrested the intruder. I made my way downstairs where two officers were waiting. They looked at me with concern. "Are you all right?" one of them asked. I nodded, still in shock. "He broke in through the window," I said, my voice trembling. "We've got him now. You're safe," the other officer said. A wave of relief washed over me. The nightmare was over. The officers stayed with me until my parents returned, making sure I was safe. I told them everything that had happened, and they reassured me. The experience had shaken me to my core, but it had also taught me to be more careful. I never liked working late. The silence of the empty office always made me uneasy, but I had no choice. The deadline was tomorrow, and I was way behind on my project. The office, usually bustling with the sounds of ringing phones and people chatting, was eerily quiet. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional creak of the building settling. My name is Tom, and I work as a graphic designer. It was a Friday night, and the office was deserted. Everyone else had left hours ago, excited for the weekend. I watched the last of my colleagues leave, envying their freedom. I took a deep breath and turned back to my computer, determined to finish my work. As the hours passed, the light outside my window dimmed until it was pitch black. The only light in the office came from my computer screen and the small desk lamp beside me. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I shook it off. It was just my imagination, I told myself. I never liked working late. Around midnight, I decided to take a break. I stood up and stretched, my muscles aching from sitting in the same position for so long. I walked over to the break room to get a cup of coffee. The hallway was dark, and my footsteps echoed on the tile floor. I flipped the switch, and the fluorescent lights flickered to life, casting a harsh, cold light. I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, taking a sip. The warmth of the coffee was comforting. As I stood there, I thought I heard a noise. It was faint, but then the screen went black. I jiggled the mouse, but nothing happened. I frowned and tried to turn it back on, but it was completely dead. Frustrated, I checked the power cable and saw that it had been unplugged. I felt a chill run through me. I knew I hadn't unplugged it. My hands trembled as I plugged it back in and turned the computer on. The screen flickered to life, and I breathed a sigh of relief, but my relief was short-lived. A message popped up on the screen. "Get out." I stared at the words, my heart pounding. I glanced at the clock, hoping the night would end soon. Suddenly, I heard the noise again. This time, it was louder. It sounded like footsteps coming from the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. The sound stopped. I took a deep breath and walked toward the hallway, my steps slow and cautious. The corridor was empty, just as it had been before. I decided to check the office one more time, just to be sure. I walked past empty desks and cubicles, my eyes scanning every shadow. Then I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but my voice echoed back at me, unanswered. Then I heard it again, the whisper. It was close, so close that I could feel the breath on my neck. I turned around slowly, my eyes wide with fear. In the corner of the room, a shadow moved. It was a figure standing still, watching me. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, silent and menacing. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. It was as if the figure was right next to me. I didn't wait to find out more. I yanked the door open with a burst of strength I didn't know I had, and ran down the hallway. I grabbed my bag and sprinted for the exit, not looking back. I burst out of the building and into the cool night air, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I never went back to that office. During the winter of 2015, 34-year-old Lenny Royal was living in Brighton, a vibrant metropolitan city on the southern coast of England. Lenny was originally from New York City, but after falling in love with an Englishman more than a decade ago, he had been splitting his time between Britain and America while pursuing his lifelong passion for hairstyling. However, Lenny was no ordinary hairstylist. He continued to maintain a reputation as one of the most talented professionals in the world. His clients included celebrities like Hailey Baldwin and Sigourney Weaver. Because he could easily find work on both sides of the Atlantic, his transatlantic lifestyle was both feasible and profitable. But towards the end of 2015, the breakdown of his 12-year relationship became the catalyst for a harrowing series of events. It's not exactly clear how Lenny's relationship came to an end, but by his own admission, the breakup sent him into a deep and debilitating depression. Lenny was prone to such bouts of melancholy, having already endured his fair share of personal tragedy. As a young boy, both of his parents passed away after contracting HIV, which led to the exceptionally deadly acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS. Lenny's father was a heroin addict who contracted HIV through shared needles. He unknowingly passed the virus on to Lenny's mother. When young Lenny learned that his parents were going to die, he was terrified. Watching them slowly slip away had a profoundly terrible effect on him. The separation from his boyfriend during the winter of 2015 brought about similar feelings of grief and loss, which in turn brought back terrible memories of his parents' deaths. Lenny knew he had to do something to shake the depression he was feeling. After a period of contemplation, he downloaded a dating app called Grindr. Lenny was undoubtedly looking for what is commonly referred to as a rebound, a brief love affair believed to boost the recently rejected self-esteem. In the process, he matched with a 24-year-old Scottish man named Daryl Rowe. Daryl, originally from the Scottish capital of Edinburgh, had also suffered through a rough upbringing. Although the details of Daryl's early childhood are murky, we know that he was adopted by two foster parents named Jackie and Harry when he was still a boy. His foster mother once described him as a really lovable boy who was good company. However, it was painfully clear that they had adopted an extremely damaged child. When Daryl arrived at their home in the nearby seaside town of North Berwick, Jackie and Harry noticed that his body was covered in scars. They were also concerned that Daryl had brought with him not one, not two, but 120 Barbie dolls, over which he displayed a fierce protectiveness. Jackie and Harry tried their best to raise Daryl, sparing no expense in the pursuit of turning his life around. However, when Daryl entered his early 20s, he suddenly announced that he was leaving Edinburgh and moving all the way down to Brighton, England. Although unconfirmed, it's easy to assume that Daryl moved to Brighton because it has long been a historical haven for young gay men. Oscar Wilde was a frequent visitor to the city, with one local historian explaining that Brighton has long been a refuge for those seeking freedom from the strictures of conventional society. Daryl thanked his foster parents for everything they had done for him, promised to stay in touch, and ultimately relocated in April 2015. About 8 months later, Daryl and Lenny connected on Grindr. After an initial period of flirtatious conversation, Daryl suggested they meet. At first, the idea of meeting excited Lenny. Daryl was 10 years younger than him, and knowing that he could attract someone so young and handsome made the older Lenny feel much better about his recently dissolved relationship. In fact, Daryl seemed to be in awe of Lenny's age, experience, and glamorous profession. However, the pride Daryl's charm reignited in Lenny may have seriously clouded his judgment regarding what happened next. Daryl and Lenny texted back and forth for a few days, toying with the idea of meeting up for a date. But then, one day, Daryl made a suggestion that made Lenny feel deeply uncomfortable. When the subject of physical intimacy arose, Daryl seemed to flippantly dismiss the idea of using a prophylactic. In other words, he flat out refused to wear any kind of protection. For Lenny, this was a definitive red line, and although he and Daryl had already exchanged phone numbers, he was so offended that he began the process of blocking him on various social media platforms. It was only at the very last second that Daryl managed to salvage his attempt at romance when he made a categorical promise to wear protection if they became intimate. Daryl might have saved himself from Lenny's blocked profile section, but he was still on thin ice. Over the next few days, he worked to regain Lenny's trust by swapping a series of innocuous selfies with him. His efforts paid off, and it was around this time that Daryl convinced Lenny to share his home address. Daryl later said the exchange of information was simply part of getting to know his prospective date. But just hours later, Daryl showed up on Lenny's doorstep. Naturally, Lenny was surprised by Daryl's sudden appearance, especially since Daryl called his cell phone using a withheld number before announcing, "I'm outside your door." Yet somehow, Daryl managed to talk his way into Lenny's home, most likely through sheer flattery and possibly with a dash of emotional blackmail. Perhaps there was talk of a miscommunication, with Daryl saying how he'd come an awfully long way just to turn around and go home again. There's no doubt that Lenny made a sizable error in judgment by allowing a near stranger into his home, and by his own admission, it was an extremely regrettable decision. Yet the price he paid is the stuff of nightmares. After a few hours of drinking and flirting, the two men climbed into bed together, and at Lenny's insistence, Daryl swore he'd wear a prophylactic. Once their lovemaking had concluded, the prospective couple engaged in deep conversation, with Daryl sharing his passion for veganism and juicing. Lenny then attempted to share some of his own interests, but shockingly, Daryl tried to convince him of the benefits of drinking his own urine. Things got a little weird, as Lenny later put it. Then I was like, okay, this was nice, but you need to go now. Lenny made it clear that he wasn't rude to Daryl. He simply informed him of some very real dinner plans he had made for that evening, thanked him for a lovely time, and politely asked him to leave. On the surface, Daryl respected Lenny's wishes, but in the days that followed, he made it clear that he'd felt deeply. Daryl not only complained bitterly to Lenny, but he also became increasingly erratic when he felt that he wasn't receiving the proper amount of attention. To Lenny, it was clear their budding relationship had no future whatsoever. So, after informing Daryl of his wish to part ways, Lenny blocked his number, preventing him from calling or texting. About a week went by when Lenny received a call on his cell phone from an unknown number. Curious, he answered the call, only to hear Daryl Rowe's voice on the other end. "How dare you block me?" Daryl demanded. "You honestly think that you can get rid of me so easily? You'll never get rid of me, ever. You're going to burn, Lenny. You're going to burn." Once it became clear that the sole purpose of the call was to unleash a torrent of abuse, Lenny Royal ended the call and blocked the number. He believed it was nothing more than the work of a bitter former lover lashing out in spite. Little did he know, Daryl's words had a horrifying significance. 2 weeks later, Lenny woke up one morning feeling a little under the weather. He figured that he had simply caught a cold, and with the proper rest, would most likely recover in a matter of days. But when a few days turned into an entire week of malaise, Lenny visited a pharmacist to purchase antibiotics. However, after describing his symptoms, the pharmacist strongly recommended that he visit a hospital for a more in-depth diagnosis. Lenny did as advised and underwent a full checkup following a visit to his local GP. Then, when the results of various tests came in, Lenny received a call from his doctor, one that would change his life forever. Lenny, who believed that he was suffering from little more than a stubborn strain of influenza, was told that he was HIV positive. "I felt like that was it. My life was over," he later said. "I was crushed." Following the death of his parents, Lenny had moved in with an older cousin, whom he later came to regard as his adoptive father. He was devastated, Lenny said. "He felt like he'd failed to protect me from the very same thing that killed my parents. And he promised my mom I'd never suffer like she did. I had to tell him it wasn't his fault over and over, but he still cried. He still said he felt like a failure." In the weeks following his diagnosis, Lenny made repeated trips to a local medical clinic to receive medication and examinations. Being the social butterfly that he is, Lenny often engaged the clinic's nurses in casual, and sometimes not so casual conversation. In one case, he even shared intimate details regarding the events leading up to his diagnosis. As he spoke, the nurse Lenny was talking to turned ashen-faced and at first appeared hesitant to speak before saying, "I really shouldn't be telling you this, but you're the fourth person this has happened to in the last 6 months alone." Lenny couldn't believe his ears. Assuming there had been some kind of miscommunication, Lenny reiterated that in his deepest, darkest thoughts, he wondered if a former lover had deliberately infected him with HIV. There had been no miscommunication. The nurse confirmed that in the recent past, 3 additional men had reported being deliberately infected with HIV by a recent lover. Not only that, but the same malevolent person had actually taunted them via phone calls following their infection, hinting cryptically at the ordeals that awaited them. The first was a man in his early 30s. Stuart Roger, who made contact with Daryl using the dating app Grindr back in July of 2015. In a very similar fashion to his interaction with Lenny, Daryl was insistent that he and Stuart meet at the first available opportunity. He insisted that Stuart stop by his Brighton apartment, and when he did so, Stuart found the front door open and unlocked. "Just come on in," Daryl said via text message. "I'm waiting for you." Shortly after Stuart's arrival, he and Daryl became intimate, and as far as Stuart knew, Daryl had worn the appropriate protection. However, once their intimacy had concluded, Stuart noticed that a prophylactic device had been removed from its packet, yet appeared completely unused. Concerned that Daryl had somehow deceived him, Stuart sought assurance that the prophylactic had been employed. Daryl flippantly dismissed his concerns by asking, "Are you one of these paranoid people?" "Yes, I wore protection, so chill out." Once sufficiently reassured that Daryl had complied with his wishes, Stuart attempted to engage his new lover in conversation. Yet, when Daryl seemed much more interested in showing Stuart his favorite Pokemon videos on YouTube, Stuart suggested that they part ways and arrange to see each other again soon. Again, Daryl seemed to take the polite dismissal in stride, but not long after Stuart's departure, he called him on his cell phone. Stuart assumed the purpose of the call was to arrange a second meeting, but when he answered his phone, Daryl remained silent. Stuart asked if he was okay, but again, Daryl chose to stay silent until he eventually ended the call without saying a word. Having demonstrated himself unsuitable for a mature relationship, Stuart opted for no further contact with Daryl. The increasingly erratic Daryl continued to reach out, but just 8 days later, Stuart received a flurry of text messages from an unrecognized cell number. "You're a revolting jackass," one message read. "Ha! I'd taken the protection off." Stuart was stunned, but he didn't understand the message's true significance until a few weeks later when he began to feel gravely ill. The second of Daryl's more recent victims was a man named Peter, who matched with the young Scotsman after realizing they frequented the same gym. He was a good-looking guy, Peter later said. He was also very charming at first, but that all changed very quickly. Daryl repeated the pattern of insisting he and Peter meet as soon as possible, and then when they did, he told Peter that he would not be wearing any protection during physical intimacy. Peter was hesitant. He knew the risks involved, but Daryl swore on all that he held dear that he was clean and that any intimacy they shared would be safe. However, afterward, the same post-coital pattern played out. After displaying a shocking level of immaturity, Peter proposed that they part ways. Yet just days later, Daryl sent him a text message informing him of some utterly terrifying news. "I lied," the message said. "I'm HIV positive." Peter was horrified and asked Daryl if he was serious or merely attempting to psychologically terrorize him in revenge for discontinuing their tryst. "He's making this up," Peter told himself. "He's just being childish." But Daryl was not making things up. He had deliberately infected Peter with HIV. A third man named Andrew shared a similar story. He matched with Daryl via the same dating app as the others, and at first, there was a great deal of chemistry. "He was hot and seemed like a nice person," Andrew later recalled. "At the same time, I didn't have any reason to question that." When Andrew and Daryl met for the first time, neither of them was carrying any kind of protection, but they decided to become intimate regardless. Andrew ended up staying overnight at Daryl's place, and later claimed that at that point, he believed they might kindle a long-term relationship. But this time, it took less than 24 hours for Daryl to turn on him. The following morning, as Andrew traveled by bus to his home, he decided to check for any new messages on the Grindr dating app. However, when a user activates the app to check messages, it notifies connected users of their activity, and this is how Daryl discovered Andrew was still using the dating app. Less than an hour after they parted ways, this discovery sent Daryl into a rage. "I can't believe you're online already," Daryl told Andrew via text message. Andrew initially thought Daryl was kidding and that the message constituted nothing more than flirtatious banter. Yet, when it became evident that Daryl was genuinely furious and that his show of possessiveness was not an attempt at humor, Andrew blocked him on all platforms and resigned himself to move on. However, just over a month later, While Andrew was out drinking with a coworker, he received a series of text messages on his cell phone. "I hope you enjoyed yourself," the first message read, followed by another with a smiley emoji. "I have HIV, and now you do too." The timing of Daryl's text messages is extremely significant. These days, if someone is exposed to HIV, they can obtain a drug known as post-exposure prophylaxis, PEP, which can stop an infection if taken within 72 hours. Daryl could have easily informed his lovers of his HIV status, but he deliberately waited weeks to drop the bombshell, knowing he had exposed them to one of the deadliest diseases in modern history. When each of Daryl's 4 victims realized his claims were legitimate, they experienced a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and fear before rushing to the appropriate medical services for testing. In some cases, the wait was just 24 hours, but every second of gnawing uncertainty was nothing short of psychological torture. Andrew sat alone, guzzling a bottle of wine and praying the results would come back negative. The next day, when the call from the doctor came, he trembled with fear as he went through the formalities of confirming his identity. Andrew had almost resigned himself to the prospect of living out what little time he had left as an HIV carrier, eventually suffering from AIDS. But once the security formalities were out of the way, the doctor told Andrew that his test results were negative. He almost collapsed with relief. The same could be said for Peter, who also received the all-clear after a brief but agonizing wait. Stuart Roger, on the other hand, was not so fortunate. When informed by his doctor that he had contracted HIV, Stuart was devastated, but he swiftly informed the police of Daryl Rose's actions, providing them with a detailed description of Daryl, his cell phone number, his home address, and several screenshots of their text message exchange. "From the moment I got my diagnosis, I was acutely aware that I would have to report this," he later said, adding that Daryl was obviously an exceptionally dangerous person who urgently needed to be stopped. Thanks to the information provided by Stuart, the police were able to track Daryl to the nearby town of Saltdean before placing him under arrest. To ensure he couldn't escape, the police opted for a dawn raid rather than a regular knock at the door. After smashing their way into his apartment, officers discovered Daryl in bed with another man, later revealed to be his 8th known victim of deliberate transmission. Upon seizing Daryl's phone and investigating the extent of his criminality, police uncovered hundreds of potential victims across his multiple social media accounts, many of which were established under false identities. Each of these men had to be contacted by police and informed of their potential diagnosis. Following his arrest, Daryl was interviewed under caution, and the number of charges against him rapidly ballooned from 1 to 4 to 7 in the space of just a few hours. During the recorded interview, Daryl claimed he wasn't aware of his HIV status, but this was an outright lie. By the time of the interview, Daryl had been explicitly aware of his diagnosis for almost 12 months. The police knew he was attempting to deceive them, and while he could have been tried in England, most of his offenses were committed in Scotland before his relocation to Brighton. As a result, he was transferred into the custody of Scottish police and transported to Edinburgh. For reasons unknown, once across the border, Scottish police chose to release Daryl on bail into the custody of his foster parents. However, almost immediately after the emotional reunion, Daryl attempted to escape justice by hiding in the Pentland Hills, which loom over the city of Edinburgh. When Lenny heard that Daryl had escaped police custody, he was furious. "I couldn't believe they released him," Lenny said, "especially since he kept saying that he was going to do it to other men." He was obviously sick in the head. During a search of the Edinburgh countryside, police eventually found an abandoned tent containing a carton of prescription medication, an antiviral used by HIV carriers. The name on the medication was Daryl R. Police already suspected Daryl was hiding in the Pentland Hills, but what was particularly alarming was that all the pills remained untouched in their blister packets. The medicine's purpose was to make his infection less contagious, and by refusing to take it, Daryl's intention to recommence the infection of others was chillingly clear. By November of 2016, the hunt for Daryl Rowe had entered its 11th month, and around 25 additional victims had come forward to report physical interactions with him. Naturally, the police focused their searches around the cities of Brighton and Edinburgh. However, little did they know, Daryl had made his way to Newcastle using the pseudonym Gary Cole. Daryl attempted to keep a low profile but continued to use dating apps to infect additional victims, the first of whom was a man named Tom. "It's always been nearly impossible for me to approach a man," Tom later confessed. "I guess that's probably why I've been quite gullible." Daryl managed to convince Tom that he was in love with him and ended up spending a total of 3 months living under Tom's roof, completely rent-free. He said that I had nice eyes and that he liked older men. "I was very flattered," Tom admitted. "I might have fallen in love with the guy, but Daryl's behavior soon shifted from charming and thoughtful to manipulative and malevolent. Let's just say that he was able to control me in a way I won't ever allow again," said Tom. Meanwhile, police forces in both Scotland and England were busy scouring the internet for any trace of Daryl Rowe. Their search led them to an escort website where a detective noticed stark similarities between the body of an advertised subject and Daryl's. They also had a cell phone number connected to it, and when police triangulated its signal, it was determined to be in the home of Daryl's unsuspecting lover, Tom. Officers rushed to Tom's home, but when Daryl realized he had once again been tracked down by the police, he attempted to escape. Trapped on the home's upper floors, he leaped from a third-story window into the garden of one of Tom's neighbors. However, when he landed on the wet grass, he slipped and fell on his back, severely injuring his spine and fracturing several vertebrae. The police found him lying there in a lot of pain, Tom said. He couldn't move or walk properly. Assuming Tom was an accomplice who knowingly harbored a criminal, the police took him into custody for around 5 hours. However, once he discovered who Gary Cole really was, Tom's arrest became the least of his worries. Thankfully, the police issued him a 30-minute HIV test, and he breathed a sigh of relief when the results came back negative. "That was obviously good news," Tom said, "but I didn't really feel any better. I felt used." As Daryl was brought to trial, it marked a watershed moment in British legal history. Never before had anyone been tried for the crime of deliberately spreading a dangerous pathogen. After viewing a catalogue of damning evidence, including the texts in which he taunted his victims, a jury of his peers found Daryl guilty on 5 counts of causing grievous bodily harm and 5 counts of attempted grievous bodily harm. The presiding judge then sentenced him to life in prison, telling Daryl, "You waged a determined and hateful campaign of violence. The messages you sent make it crystal clear you knew exactly what you were doing. As well as the physical offenses, it is clear that the psychological effects upon the victims are immense." The judge added, "It should be known that this sentence is not about stigmatizing anyone living with HIV, but I cannot envision a day when you will no longer be a danger to gay men." It's reassuring to think Daryl was jailed for his actions, even if it was for a mere 5 years. Lenny later said, "But what he inflicted on his victims will stay with them for the rest of their lives." "I was pretty worried when I got my diagnosis," Lenny continued. "I thought I was going to be that person no one would ever want to be with. But while there's still some prejudice in the gay community, a lot of people don't really care. I had one negative experience with somebody I was dating, but it didn't really affect me." "It's no longer a death sentence, not even remotely," Lenny said. "But it's messed up when somebody makes that choice for you, when they take that right away from you. That's what's difficult to get over. It really is a harsh reality when you think about it. And that's the cruel thing I struggle with on a day-to-day basis. How can somebody be so cruel?"